What kind of world lets a child get hurt in plain sight, and no one moves an inch to help her? The steam was still rising when Amara Johnson stood frozen in the middle of the Beverly Hills café, her small fingers trembling as she tried to understand what had just happened. The paper cup had slipped from her grasp not because she was careless but because the heat had been too much, too sudden, too sharp for her 8-year-old hands to handle, and yet the silence around her felt louder than anything, louder than the soft jazz playing overhead, louder than the clinking of porcelain cups and the quiet conversations of people who could afford to sit there without a second thought about the price of a $12 latte, because nobody stepped forward, nobody reached out, nobody said her name, even though she hadn't given it, even though she didn't belong in their world of polished marble floors and gold-trimmed menus. And as she looked up with wide eyes searching for something, anything, she found only hesitation, judgment, and the kind of distance that couldn't be measured in feet or inches but in something far heavier, something that separated her from every person in that room, and somewhere in the corner, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, a man sat perfectly still, his presence quiet but heavy, like a storm waiting behind clear skies. Daniel Kong didn't flinch when the cup fell, didn't react when the whispers started, because to him it looked like another small incident in a city filled with noise, another moment that would resolve itself without his involvement, his fingers resting calmly against the edge of a table that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his watch catching the soft light as it ticked with precise indifference, and for a brief second his eyes met the girl's. But there was no recognition there, no urgency, just observation, the kind that comes from a man who has seen too many situations to believe every one of them deserves his attention. And so he stayed seated, because in his world problems were solved by systems, not by impulse, and children crying in public spaces were not part of his equation. And yet Amara didn't look at the people who had turned away from her. She didn't run to the exit or call for someone she knew. Instead, she stood there holding her hand close to her chest as if protecting something fragile that couldn't be seen. Her breathing uneven but controlled in a way no child should have to learn, because somewhere in her life she had already understood that making noise didn't always bring help. Sometimes it only brought more eyes, more judgment, more distance, and the café remained exactly as it was, untouched by what had just occurred, as if the moment itself had decided to belong only to her, to be carried in silence while the world continued sipping expensive drinks and discussing things that felt infinitely far away from the reality standing in the center of the room. And Daniel Kong, the man who could change everything with a single word, chose in that moment to do absolutely nothing. The distance between Amara and the man in the corner was no more than a few meters, yet it felt larger than anything she had ever crossed in her life, because every step she considered taking toward him carried a weight she could not name. A hesitation built from years of quiet lessons about where she was allowed to stand and where she was not. And still the room continued to move around her as if she were invisible, the barista now speaking to the manager in a low voice that carried just enough for nearby tables to hear fragments that painted a picture of inconvenience rather than harm, a situation to be managed rather than understood, and the manager, a man in a neatly pressed shirt, nodded with a practiced expression that suggested resolution had already been decided before any real question had been asked. He glanced briefly at Amara, not with curiosity but with calculation, measuring risk, measuring disruption, measuring how quickly this could be made to disappear, and then he turned his attention toward the counter, signaling for the staff to continue as usual, because in a place like this normalcy was more valuable than truth. And yet something small shifted in the air when Amara took her first step, her shoes making almost no sound against the polished floor, her posture uncertain but determined in a way that did not match her size, and for a moment the movement caught a few eyes, not because anyone expected her to do anything meaningful but because deviation itself was unusual, and she stopped again halfway, her hand still close to her chest, her breathing shallow as she looked directly at Daniel Kong once more, and this time her gaze did not carry confusion but intention, as if she had made a decision that she did not fully understand but could not ignore. And Daniel noticed the change, not because of the step itself but because of the way she held her ground afterward, the way she did not retreat even when the room offered no support, and something about that stillness pressed lightly against his thoughts, a faint interruption in the orderly way he processed situations, because it did not fit the pattern he expected. Children who caused problems usually avoided confrontation. They withdrew, they disappeared. But this one remained, quiet, yet present, and for the first time he considered that perhaps he had categorized the moment too quickly. Yet even then he did not rise. He simply adjusted his position slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table before becoming still again. And in that brief pause the manager approached him, his tone shifting instantly into politeness, offering a controlled apology for the disturbance while carefully avoiding any mention of responsibility, assuring him that everything was under control and that the situation would be handled immediately. And Daniel listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, because he had heard variations of this language countless times, words designed to smooth surfaces rather than reveal what lay beneath them. And while the manager spoke, Amara stood just within view, close enough now that the faint redness on her skin could be seen more clearly under the soft lighting, yet still far enough that she had not crossed fully into his space, as if waiting for permission that had not been given. And the moment stretched quietly, balanced between action and inaction, between a decision that could change everything and the habit of letting things pass. And in that silence the smallest crack began to form, not loud, not dramatic, but present. A subtle shift in the way Daniel's gaze returned to the girl, lingering half a second longer than before, as if something he could not yet name had started to take shape beneath the surface of what he thought he understood. The manager's voice faded into the background as Amara finally closed the remaining distance, each small step carrying a quiet resolve that no one had expected from someone her size. And when she reached the edge of Daniel Kang's table she did not speak immediately, as if even she understood that words alone might not be enough in a place where truth had already been replaced by convenience, her hand slowly lowering from her chest just enough to reveal the faint redness that had begun to settle into her skin, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just real in a way that could not be dismissed if anyone chose to actually see it. And Daniel's eyes followed the movement without intention at first, a reflex more than a decision. But once his attention settled there, it did not move away as quickly as before, something about the quietness of the gesture disrupting the clean narrative he had accepted moments earlier, because nothing in her expression matched the chaos that had been described to him. There was no defiance, no attempt to gain sympathy, only a steady presence that felt out of place in a situation that should have already resolved itself. And when she finally spoke her voice was barely above a whisper, not demanding, not accusing, simply asking. She said that she had not taken anything, that she had only been waiting, and that it hurt, and the simplicity of the words carried a weight that the earlier accusations did not, because they did not try to convince, they did not perform, they just existed. And for the first time Daniel did not immediately categorize what he was hearing, his mind hesitating in a way it rarely allowed, because uncertainty was not something he entertained in his world. Decisions were made quickly, efficiently, without lingering doubt, and yet here, in a place that should have required none of his attention, he found himself looking again, not at the situation as a whole but at the details he had overlooked, the angle of the counter, the placement of the cup before it fell, the way the barista had spoken too quickly, too confidently, as if filling a space before anyone else could question it, and the manager, still standing nearby, shifted slightly, sensing the change even if he did not understand its source, his posture tightening as he repeated that everything had been handled, that the girl would be asked to leave, that there was no need for further concern, and Daniel listened. But this time the words did not settle as easily. They felt rehearsed, constructed, designed to move past something rather than address it. And his gaze returned to Amara, who had not moved, who had not stepped back even when the manager's presence grew more assertive. And in that stillness another memory surfaced, not fully formed, not yet recognized, but present enough to create a quiet pressure behind his thoughts. Something from a time when he had stood in a place where his voice carried no weight, where explanations were dismissed before they were heard, and he pushed the memory aside almost immediately, because it did not belong here, it did not belong to the man he had become. And yet the feeling remained, subtle but persistent, and when he finally spoke his voice was calm, controlled, asking the girl what exactly had happened, not because he had decided to believe her, but because for the first time he was no longer certain that he should not. And the room shifted again, quieter this time, the kind of silence that forms not from disinterest but from anticipation, as if something that had been carefully contained was beginning to unfold in a way no one had planned for. Amara hesitated for a fraction of a second after his question, not because she did not know what to say but because she was not used to being asked in a way that felt real, her eyes lifting slightly as if confirming that the words had been meant for her and not just spoken into the air. And when she answered her voice remained soft but steadier than before. She said that she had been waiting by the counter because she had enough coins to buy a small pastry, that she had counted them twice in her pocket, and that when the barista placed the drink down she had stepped back to give space. But the cup had been pushed forward suddenly, not dropped, not slipped, just moved in a way she did not expect, and the heat had startled her, and she stopped there, not adding more than necessary, not building a case, simply describing what she had experienced as plainly as she could, and for a moment the simplicity of her explanation lingered in the space between them, unembellished and difficult to argue with if one chose to listen, and Daniel watched her closely. Not just her words but the rhythm of them, the pauses, the lack of urgency to convince, because in his world people who lied often added too much, filled silence with unnecessary detail. But here there was restraint, a kind of honesty that did not try to impress, and yet he did not respond immediately, because years of discipline held him in place, reminding him, disrupting the flow of their narrative in a way they could not easily redirect. The manager hesitated for just a second before answering, saying that the system had been under maintenance earlier in the day, that some angles might not have been recorded properly, and while the explanation sounded reasonable on the surface it arrived too quickly, too conveniently, and Daniel noticed the timing, the way the answer came before the question had fully settled, and his eyes shifted briefly toward the camera mounted above the register, its angle slightly off from where it should have been, and though he said nothing about it, the detail did not escape him, and behind the counter the barista adjusted her posture, her confidence thinning just enough to reveal the strain beneath it, and the room, which had begun to lean toward dismissal again, paused once more, caught between two versions of the same moment, one spoken loudly and one existing quietly in front of them, and Amara remained still, her presence unchanged, not pushing, not retreating, simply waiting in a way that suggested she had already accepted whatever outcome might come. And that acceptance, more than anything else, pressed further against the small fracture forming within Daniel's certainty, widening it just enough that the situation could no longer be resolved as easily as he had first assumed. The hesitation from the manager lingered in the air longer than his words, and Daniel Kong did not immediately respond, not because he accepted the explanation but because he was measuring it, weighing the precision of the answer against the subtle inconsistencies that had begun to surface, and in that quiet calculation his attention shifted once more to the small camera above the counter, its angle slightly misaligned in a way that would not matter to most people but stood out to someone who had built entire systems around observation and control, and for the first time since the incident began he leaned back in his chair, not as a sign of disengagement but as a deliberate pause, creating space where pressure could settle, and the room responded to that pause without realizing it. Conversation slowed, movements became more careful, as if something invisible had begun to take shape and no one wanted to be the one caught on the wrong side of it. And Amara remained exactly where she was, her presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the growing unease around her. And though she did not understand the shift, she felt it, the way the air no longer pushed against her as strongly as before, the way eyes that once dismissed her now hesitated just long enough to question what they had already accepted, and Daniel's gaze returned to her once more. But this time it did not carry the same distance. There was a subtle change, not yet belief, not yet trust, but attention in its truest form, and he asked her another question, not about the incident itself but about why she had been there, and Amara answered simply, saying that she came every week, that her mother used to work nearby and that this place had been somewhere she remembered, somewhere she thought she could stand for a little. While without being told to leave, and the words were quiet but they landed with unexpected weight, because they introduced something the room had not accounted for, a reason that did not fit into the convenient narrative of disruption, and Daniel's expression did not change, but something behind it did, something that began to connect pieces he had not considered before, and the manager, sensing the shift growing beyond his control, stepped forward again, his tone firmer now, suggesting that it would be best if the girl was escorted out to avoid further disturbance, framing the situation as a matter of policy rather than truth, and for a moment it seemed as though the decision might be forced forward again, pushed into resolution before it could fully unfold. But Daniel raised his hand slightly, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to stop the movement, and the gesture alone was enough to hold the manager in place, because authority, when real, did not need to announce itself loudly, it simply existed, and the silence that followed was different from before. It was not empty. It was filled with expectation, and Daniel spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a firmness that had not been present earlier, asking for the system logs of the camera instead of the footage itself, a detail so specific that it caught the manager off guard, because it shifted the question from what could be shown to what could be verified, and for the first time the control that had been carefully maintained behind the counter began to slip, not visibly enough for everyone to notice, but enough that those closest to the situation felt it immediately, the barista's posture tightening again, her earlier confidence now replaced with something more guarded. And in that moment the narrative that had once seemed stable began to fracture in a way that could not be easily repaired, and Daniel, who had initially chosen not to involve himself, now found that stepping back was no longer an option, not because he had decided to act, but because the truth, however small, had begun to reveal itself in ways that demanded recognition. The request for system logs did not echo loudly across the café, but it landed with a precision that changed everything, because unlike footage that could be dismissed or redirected, logs carried timestamps, actions, silent records that did not rely on memory or interpretation, and the manager understood that immediately, his expression tightening in a way he could not fully conceal, his eyes flickering briefly toward the barista before returning to Daniel Kong with a practiced calm that now felt slightly delayed, and he said that he would need to check with technical support, that access to those records was limited, that it might take some time, and the explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but the hesitation underneath it grew more visible with each word, and Daniel did not interrupt, he simply watched, allowing the space to stretch long enough for the discomfort to reveal itself, and around them the room had shifted into a different kind of silence, no longer indifferent but attentive. People who had once turned away now leaned subtly closer, their curiosity sharpened by the sense that something more than a simple misunderstanding was unfolding, and Amara remained still beside the table, her presence no longer dismissed but not yet fully acknowledged, caught in the space between what had been said and what was beginning to be questioned. And in that space another voice emerged, quieter than the others but clear enough to cut through the tension. A young employee from the far side of the counter stepped forward hesitantly, her hands slightly trembling as if she had debated this moment longer than anyone else realized. And she said that the system had been working earlier, that she had checked it during her shift, that nothing had been under maintenance at the time, and the words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable, because they did not come with authority or confidence. They came with something else, something closer to truth, and the barista's posture stiffened immediately, her gaze sharp as she turned toward the younger employee. A silent warning passing between them that spoke louder than any spoken argument, and the manager's composure cracked just slightly. Not enough for everyone to notice, but enough for Daniel to register, and in that moment the structure of the story that had been presented began to unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, precise fractures that could not be easily repaired, and Daniel leaned forward now, not abruptly but with intention, his presence shifting from passive observation to quiet authority, and he asked the young employee to repeat what she had said, giving her the space to stand in her own words. And she did, her voice steadier the second time, explaining that she had logged into the system less than 30 minutes before, that the camera had been aligned correctly, that there had been no report of malfunction, and as she spoke the weight of her words settled over the counter, pressing against the earlier claims in a way that made them harder to sustain, and Daniel's gaze moved once more to the camera, its angle still slightly off, and this time the detail was no longer a minor inconsistency but part of a larger pattern that had begun to form, and for the first time since the incident began he did not look away from it quickly. He held his attention there long enough for the implication to fully register, and when he spoke again his voice was calm but carried a firmness that left little room for dismissal. He said that the logs would not be necessary if the system had been functioning, that the alignment of the camera alone raised a question that could not be ignored, and the simplicity of the statement made it more powerful, because it did not accuse, it did not escalate, it simply pointed to something that was already visible, and in that moment the balance of the room shifted completely, no longer leaning toward convenience but toward truth, and the barista, who had once controlled the narrative with ease, now found herself standing within it, her earlier confidence replaced by a tension that could not be hidden, while Amara, still small and quiet beside the table, had become the center of a moment that was no longer hers alone but belonged to everyone who had chosen to see it. The shift in the room did not arrive with noise but with awareness, the kind that spreads quietly from one person to another until it settles over everyone at once, and Daniel Kong remained seated for a moment longer as if allowing the truth to finish revealing itself without interference. His eyes moving from the camera to the barista and then briefly to the manager, not with anger but with a level of focus that made both of them visibly uncomfortable, because they understood that the situation was no longer about a simple misunderstanding but about something far more difficult to contain, and the young employee who had spoken earlier stepped back slightly, her role in the moment complete yet still present in the tension she had helped expose, and Amara stood beside the table, her posture unchanged but her presence now impossible to ignore, not because she had raised her voice or demanded attention, but because everything around her had begun to align with what she had said. From the beginning, and Daniel finally stood, the movement slow and deliberate, not dramatic but undeniable, and the sound of his chair shifting against the floor carried more weight than any words spoken so far, because it marked a decision, a crossing from observation into involvement, and as he rose the distance between him and the counter seemed to collapse instantly, not in physical space but in authority, and the manager straightened his posture instinctively, his earlier confidence replaced with a careful attentiveness that bordered on unease, while the barista remained still, her expression tightening as if bracing for something she could no longer control, and Daniel walked toward the counter with measured steps, each one steady and unhurried, giving the moment time to settle into what it had become, and when he stopped in front of them he did not raise his voice, he did not accuse, he simply asked the barista to explain again what had happened. But this time the question carried a different weight, because it was no longer an inquiry seeking clarity but a request that demanded alignment with what was already visible, and the barista spoke. But her words no longer held the same certainty. They shifted slightly, small changes in phrasing, subtle adjustments that attempted to reconcile her earlier statement with the new pressure in the room, and Daniel listened without interruption, his gaze steady, and when she finished he nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and then he turned slightly, his attention moving back to the camera above the register, and he reached up just enough to indicate its position without touching it, pointing out that its angle had been altered, that it no longer faced the exact area where the incident occurred, and he asked a simple question: when had it been moved? And the silence that followed was immediate, not because no one knew the answer but because answering it would require admitting something that could not be undone, and the manager attempted to step in again, offering to review everything internally, to resolve the matter privately, but Daniel's presence made the suggestion feel insufficient, as if the idea of containing the truth no longer matched the scale of what had been uncovered. And in that moment the balance of power became unmistakable, not just between a man and a business but between what was convenient and what was right, and Amara, still small and quiet at the edge of it all, had become the center of a shift that extended far beyond her, a shift that Daniel himself had not intended to create but now could not ignore, because the longer he stood there the clearer it became that this was not just about what had happened to her. It was about what had been allowed to happen in a place that operated under his name without him ever truly seeing it, and that realization settled slowly but firmly, like a truth that could not be dismissed once recognized. The question about the camera did not receive an answer, but the silence itself became an answer, stretching across the counter in a way that made every second feel longer than it should have, and Daniel Kong did not repeat himself, because he did not need to. The absence of a response had already revealed more than any explanation could offer, and he lowered his hand slowly, his gaze returning to the barista with a calm that felt heavier than anger, because it carried certainty, and in that certainty the structure that had protected her began to collapse, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a quiet unraveling that could not be stopped, and the manager shifted again, this time stepping slightly forward as if to reclaim control of the situation. His voice measured as he suggested that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that the camera angle might have been adjusted earlier for maintenance purposes, that the details could be clarified later, but the words no longer held the same authority. They sounded like attempts rather than solutions, and Daniel listened without interruption, allowing the explanation to finish before responding. And when he did his voice remained steady, not raised, not sharp, but unmistakably final. He said that misunderstandings required uncertainty, and that what he was seeing did not leave much room for that, and the simplicity of the statement removed the space the manager had been trying to create, leaving the moment exposed, and behind the counter the barista's composure finally began to show visible strain, her shoulders tightening, her eyes shifting briefly toward the younger employee who had spoken earlier, as if searching for support that was no longer there, and for the first time since the incident began. She did not immediately speak, because the version of events she had constructed could not easily adjust to the direction the truth was taking, and Daniel turned slightly, his attention moving back to Amara, who had remained silent through the exchange, her small frame still, her eyes watching without expectation, and there was something in that lack of expectation that settled deeply, because it suggested that she had not come forward believing she would be believed. She had come forward because she had no other option, and that realization shifted something further within him, something that connected not just to the present moment but to a broader pattern he had not fully acknowledged. And he asked her one more question, not about the incident but about her mother, asking where she worked, and Amara answered simply, saying that her mother used to clean offices nearby but lost her job some months ago, that things had been harder since then, and that she sometimes came to this café because it reminded her of when her mother would pass by here on her way home, and the words were quiet, almost casual. But they carried a weight that extended beyond the room, because they introduced a layer of reality that the polished environment had been built to ignore, and Daniel's gaze held on her for a moment longer, the pieces aligning more clearly now, the pattern no longer abstract but personal, and when he turned back to the counter his presence had changed again, no longer just attentive but resolved, and he spoke not to ask but to state, saying that the situation would not be handled privately, that it would not be dismissed, that accountability required visibility, and the shift in his tone left no room for negotiation, and the manager, recognizing the boundary that had just been drawn, fell silent, because there are moments when authority is no longer about position but about clarity, and in that moment Daniel Kong had made it clear that what had happened would not be allowed to disappear, not this time, not in a place that carried his name, and the room, once filled with quiet dismissal, now held a different kind of stillness, one that waited for what would come next, knowing that whatever it was, it would not return things to the way they had been.